before we get to the Oscars and those preachers, something very much more worrying. You've got to ask, could our CSIRO, our top scientific research body, actually be helping the Chinese military to build a better submarine? Inadvertently, of course. We have something, you see, called the Centre for Southern Hemisphere Oceans Research. It's looking at things like ocean temperatures and currents. All sounds innocent. Our CSIRO funds it, but so does China's Qingdao National Laboratory for Marine Science and Technology. It's a joint project. Big problem. The thing is that the head of this centre is also a professor at that Chinese laboratory, which, get this, does military-related research, like developing satellite-based laser to detect submarines. Now, China's dictator, President Xi Jinping, has even given a lecture at that Chinese laboratory. He wants civil organisations exactly like that to fuse with the Chinese military, share their knowledge. And all this while we're trying to build 12 new future submarines at some ginormous cost to defend ourselves from potential attacks from countries just like China. Ross Babbage is a former head of strategic analysis at our Office of National Assessments. He's now with the Washington-based Centre for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. He joined me earlier. Ross Babbage, thank you so much for joining us. Does this make sense, where we have the CSIRO and an institute, a project in China that's involved with military type of research, working together on a program here?
Well, it certainly raises some very serious questions about how this came to be and whether, in fact, the CSIRO management really understands the implications of what might be happening here. Data gathering in the underwater environment, especially around Australia, and in this case, I think largely to the south of Australia, is strategically very important indeed. And we know that if you look at this institute and the 8 major research laboratories that fit into it, and also several other joint laboratories that they conduct with other Chinese entities, some of them, seems to me, are really unquestionably directed at Chinese Navy requirements. On top of that, the actual physical location of this institute is really just, it's in the same city as the largest Chinese naval base in northern China, and the major headquarters of the theatre command for the People's Liberation Army, and that includes the Navy, is just up the road. So this institute does seem to be doing a lot of work of great relevance to the Chinese military, and to be very closely located to some of the most powerful naval forces in the Western Pacific.
Now, obviously, the professor in charge of this joint facility, he wouldn't, be wanting to help the Chinese regime, to help itself to our secrets or anything like that. And yet, what is the danger here?
Well, I think the danger is that Australian research assets and capabilities, including that, of course, the brain power that we bring to the party, is being handed over or shared on key data sets with Chinese institutes, which are very likely to share that data for non-civil purposes. And so understanding the water column, understanding what is actually going on to the south of Australia underwater is strategically very important to this country, but it's also very important to our allies. But clearly it has big implications and big potentially important value to the Chinese Navy, because they are expanding their submarine force very substantially, and increasingly they're putting to sea nuclear-powered submarines, some of which have ballistic missiles fitted, and they need access to areas that are very quiet, very out of the way, that are not really frequently visited by the US Navy, for instance. And some of the waters that are being looked at right now, it seems to me, have the potential to be very valuable to Chinese strategic planners and naval planners in particular.
Is it too much of a stretch to suggest that the CSIRO, our chief scientific research organisation, government funded, our CSIRO may be helping China's Navy get better submarines, potentially for use in a conflict with us?
That's a possibility. I think there's also perhaps an even stronger possibility that the data sets that are being provided and the way anti-submarine warfare is done these days, it's big data is really very important. So understanding exactly what's happening and how to interpret it is really critical. We know that this research institute is working on things that from space to detect things underwater from space, and is running a substantial amount of research there. It's hard for me to separate the things in the way that this institute is structured. And so as a consequence, I think I really wonder how the CSIRO judged that this was not a challenge against the national interest. And I wonder how they assessed it. I wonder how they, who actually made the assessment. Were they people who had any experience of the Chinese military and the Chinese intelligence services? And if they did make a decision that it wasn't likely to be a sensitive program and project, on what basis did they do that? And was that the subject to any sort of review? And I think this is raising some pretty fundamental issues, not only for the CSIRO, but I happen to be aware that the Australian Research Council in recent years in their projects has funded many not dissimilar projects out of Australian universities. And my understanding also is that in the last 5 years or so, not one of those has been rejected on public interest grounds or national interest grounds. So I think there's a bigger issue here, and that is how are we as a country and research institutes that are working with overseas authoritarian countries, how are we judging what is legitimate and sensible and what is definitely against the national interest? And I think we need to review those processes very carefully indeed.
Sounds like an urgent job for the Defence Minister, the Science Minister, the Education Minister. I'm flabbergasted. Ross Babbage, thank you so much indeed for your help.
It's a pleasure.